Thank you very much, Will. That was most generous. As someone said earlier, I just wish my wife were here to hear that. I want to thank all of you for being here. This is a great honor for me to be with you, and a great honor to be involved in the Lester Randall Preaching Fellowship, and a particular honor this evening to be the lecturer for the Donald and Marilyn Toe lectureship. I'm grateful, very much so, for all of that. I want to thank my friend Peter Holmes as well for his warm hospitality and his superb organization, and all the volunteers who've made this just such a wonderful experience for all of us. And that meal this evening, my gosh. I gave a presentation a little bit earlier on surviving in the parish, and one of the parts of that presentation had to do with staying healthy, and I cited a Duke University study that said ministers are not very healthy, and for one thing, we don't eat very well. We eat too much, and so there we were facing it tonight, and I thought they're fattening this American up for the kill, maybe, but in any event, that was quite a meal, and I've been grateful for the hospitality. You know, I always seem to have an adventure when I come to Toronto, and I told this story at St. Andrew's Sunday, and they liked it, so I thought I would try it again. If you're from St. Andrew's, you can check your emails now. That'd be all right. I first came to Toronto, I believe, not long after 9/11, and you may remember that your immigration service was particularly diligent in those days. Our government had decided after 9/11 that everyone coming into the United States would have to be scrutinized very carefully and even fingerprinted. And our good neighbors to the north took umbrage at that, and rightfully so. And the word around Chicago was that if you're going to Canada, expect the immigration service to respond by being a little less friendly than usual. And sure enough, the officer who looked at our passports looked carefully and asked me what I was going to do in Canada. And I told her I was going to preach a sermon and deliver a few lectures. And she asked me what the topics would be, and I told her. And then she said, tell me, is there no one in Canada who can do this job? Well, I made a mistake of being honest and saying, well, I can't say that. There are probably a lot of people in Canada who could do that. And she said, all right, sir, over there into the next room, where I sat for a full 30 minutes and was grilled as to the content of what I was going to do, and asked that question over and over again. Well, why would they ask you if there are people here? And I don't know. Finally, I was allowed in. And in the meantime, my wife, waiting not very patiently, by the way, in the waiting area, overhearing all this, said, why didn't you just lie? Why didn't you just tell them, yes, you're the only person in the world who can do this? So as I kissed her goodbye Saturday, she said, now, remember, if they ask you if you're the only one, tell them, yes, you're the only one that can do this in the whole world. So I approached immigration at the airport with great fear and trembling Saturday afternoon. And sure enough, the officer asked me, what was I doing here? And I said, well, I'm a Presbyterian minister from the United States, and I've been invited to preach at St. Andrew's Church in Toronto. And he said, well, what are you going to preach about? I thought, it's an odd thing for immigration officers to be asking, but what are you going to preach about? And for some reason, I said, well, it's All Saints Sunday, so I'm going to talk about the saints of the church. And he said, you're late. It's All Souls today. All Saints. He said, this is November 3rd. Welcome to Canada. He must have been a high church Anglican. Presbyterians have no idea what All Souls is. I cannot think of a more audacious act, an act that borders on public foolishness, than standing up in the company of fellow believers and in essence declaring the words you are about to hear just may contain a word from the Lord. I cannot think of a more challenging responsibility than to accept a group of people's invitation to do that, to bring a life-saving word from the Lord to them once a week or so, consistently, steadily, faithfully, week in and week out, season in and season out, on good days and not so good days. I am one who has done that foolish act for most Sundays in the last 50 years. On occasion, fairly regularly in fact, staring at a blank sheet of paper late in the week, distracted by the necessities of the life of a busy church, the denominations, committees, and task forces, the Rotary lunch and junior high sports banquet that I agreed to deliver the invocation at, exhausted by the relentless demands of a profession whose job description knows no limits. Whatever creative well I used to have bone dry and dusty, I found myself wondering, after all these years, if I really belonged in this business. Maybe I should have gone to law school. Maybe I should be selling insurance. And on more than one occasion, worried and struggled and fussed all week long, and then sat down and ground out a sermon, one sentence, one word at a time, until I had filled up the requisite number of legal-size sheets, 10 to be exact, that I know take 20 minutes to deliver, and carried it into the pulpit on Sunday, ashamed of myself for not being better at this. And then was stunned afterward when someone said, "You must have written that for me. How did you know?" And that was exactly what I needed to hear this morning. And fought back the urge to say, "You must be kidding. That was a terrible sermon." And instead found myself saying, "Thank you," not only to my parishioner, but to God, who is apparently involved in this process and apparently can use the humblest effort to speak a healing word to someone who needs it. Jesus, the gospel writer says, came preaching. Preaching has been at the heart of the church's life and witness from the beginning. From that improbable beginning, it has been based on the incredible notion that God has something to say to creation, that it is of the very essence of God to be in communication with creation, that communication is so much of the essence of the divine that the fourth gospel says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." God, we believe, spoke and speaks in creation, in the ongoing evolution of life and the world and the universe. God, we believe, spoke to men and women back on the edge of history, called them by name, called them to live in covenant with one another and with God, called them in their obedient and faithful life together to be a word to the world, a light to the nations. God, we believe, ultimately spoke in the birth of a child, the life of a young man, teaching, healing, breaking down barriers, reconciling, and finally, in one magnificent, almost unspeakable act, God speaking in his death on the cross, his full descent into humanness, alienation, despair, sin, isolation. God, we believe, spoke in the first rays of the sun at dawn on the first day of the week, spoke a saving, life-giving word in his resurrection. God, we believe, speaks in words of Scripture, and this most improbable of all, God continues to use the words of women and men who read and study and struggle with the words of Scripture and study the world around them and wrestle with their own doubts, their own faith, their own intellectual capacities, their emotions and deepest passion, and then stand up on Sunday morning in the midst of the congregation and speak. There is, frankly, nothing quite like that in human history and in human experience. In an age of instant digital communication that David Lowe so masterfully captured for us this afternoon, an age so fast that attention spans are now measured in seconds, an age of 24-hour news cycles and rabid talk shows and advertising so superbly sophisticated that you and I aren't even aware of its deeply persuasive power. It's a major miracle, is it not, that they still come on Sunday morning, get out of bed and come and sit on hardwood, uncomfortable pews and give their undivided attention to the woman or man they have called to be their preacher. They will do that for no one else every week, 20 to 25 minutes of silent, uninterrupted, undivided attention. I am of the opinion, for what it's worth, that as goes preaching, so goes the church. That essential to the life and faithfulness and mission of the church is preaching, the regular proclamation of good news through which God continues to address both church and world. And so I cannot tell you how pleased I am to have been invited to be part of this project, this Toronto Festival of Preaching. And I'm honored to be among some of the very best of us, Jana Childers and David Luce and Paul Scott Wilson, superb scholars who know so very much. And as I thought about what I might bring to this festival, I was keenly aware that the three of them know a whole lot more about this than I do, and that I might be safer taking a different tack. So the church, the body in which preaching happens, the institution that I have proposed depends on preaching. The phenomenon which almost everyone agrees is either in a lot of trouble or in its death throes or is changing so rapidly that those of us who live in it and work in it and love it and care about it are perplexed and fearful and occasionally even a little hopeful. What in the world will become of us? Do we have a future? Does Christianity really need the church? Well, let's start with some good news. I found some very good news recently. Church is good for you. A Stanford University anthropologist by the name of T.M. Lorman has done research on people who attend church and people who do not attend church and has reported his findings in a New York Times article with the title, "The Benefits of Church." That would catch the preacher's eye, so I read it. One of the most striking scientific discoveries about religion, Professor Lorman says, in recent years is that going to church is good for you. Attending church regularly apparently boosts the immune system and decreases blood pressure. Lorman says that going to church regularly may add 2 or 3 years to your life. Think of that. Think of that gorgeous high-tech digital sign out in front of York Minster Baptist Church flashing instead of preaching festival, attend this church and add 3 years to your life. Think of promotional materials. Work out at your health club, cut back on red meat and trans fats, eat smart, and come to church on Sunday. Professor Lorman confesses that the reasons why church is good for you are not entirely clear. The professor speculates that social support is part of it. Church people really do seem to look out for one another, show up with dinner when friends are sick, to talk, or when they're unhappy. Frequent churchgoers have larger social networks than non-churchgoers, more contact with, more affection for, and more kinds of social support. So, attending church, belonging to church, supporting a church is healthy. It's a lot healthier than not. And yet, everyone knows that the church, particularly what we refer to as the mainline church, is declining and seems to be in a lot of trouble. And it's not just the United States. Your Douglas John Hall, one of the real gifts to all of us, reminds us that it is a North America phenomenon and that you are in as much trouble as we are, in fact, maybe a little more. Frederick Buechner, author, novelist, Presbyterian minister, whose books have been a companion and inspiration and resource for me and for many, many of us for the past 40 years, once said that maybe the best thing that could happen to the church would be for it all to be washed away in a great tidal wave. All the church buildings and pews and pulpits, all the hymnals and prayer books and books of order, all the committee reports and resolutions and overtures, all of it tumbling over and over, washed away. And when it is all gone, Buechner said, all we would have left is Christ and one another, which is all we had in the first place. And frankly, sometimes it feels to me like that is exactly what is happening, a great tidal wave of history threatening to wash it all away. When I was ordained to the ministry of Word and Sacrament, 1963, 50 years ago this past summer, the Presbyterian Church, the church I know best, was almost 4 million strong and growing. That church had been part of American history and culture from the very beginning and before. In pre-revolutionary colonies, we were one of 3 major church groups that came along with the early settlers: Puritan Congregationalists, Anglicans, and Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. And when the Continental Congress declared independence, an event that may be perceived differently in Canada than it is in the United States, my Scottish colleague, by the way, Callum MacLeod, every 4th of July delights in telling me, well, it's time again to lament the lost colonies. On that occasion, one of ours, John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian minister and president of the College of New Jersey at Princeton, was the only clergyman to sign it. And when the new Congress met to write a constitution about 12 years later for the new republic in Philadelphia, Presbyterians were holding their first national assembly down the street. Presbyterians are proud that the founders' political thinking was influenced not only by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, but also by the radical political implications of Calvinism, namely that each individual created in the image of God has value and dignity and rights, that political authority originates not hierarchically in king and pope, but with the people. That power in the civil arena and in the church begins with the people, who then, in their God-given liberty, confer it on those they choose to govern. Mainline Protestants in North America, because of confidence in the God-given potential of the individual, led the way in establishing institutions of education, public education, the crown jewel of the Scottish Reformation. The first thing Protestant Christians did after establishing a new church on the frontier was organize a school, a college, a theological seminary. Well, in the 1960s, when I came of age ecclesiastically, we were at the top of our game. Presbyterians had consolidated our national organization and mission and educational programs in a national headquarters. We built a wonderful new office building on Riverside Drive in Manhattan, just like IBM. President Eisenhower was a Presbyterian, baptized a Presbyterian while in office, was there that day to help dedicate the new Interchurch Center, 475, what we used to affectionately call the Vatican on the Hudson. Our highest officer, stated clerk Eugene Clarkson Blake, was on the cover of Time magazine several times. I loved it. And then something happened. What it was exactly has been and still is the subject of endless study and analysis, a relentless search for a villain. Presbyterians' favorite activity, it seems to me at this time in our history, is to find someone to blame for this. Maybe it's the liberals or the conservatives. David Lose said today, the most important thing I think maybe that anyone has said in this whole conference, it's not your fault. It's nothing about which you need to feel guilty. Mainline Protestant churches have always seen as part of their mission to be deeply involved in the life of the community and nation. For Presbyterians, just as John Calvin's Reformed Church was involved in the political and social and economic life of 16th century Geneva, we've spoken our minds on the major issues of the day in every age. In our time, on issues of justice and race and gender, and stewardship of the environment. Some seem to want to conclude that what has happened to us was that the church got too far ahead of its members who began to quit because they disagreed with what the church was saying. The truth is that argument does not hold. Study after study has failed to produce evidence that church membership decline was caused by the church's progressive political stances or pronouncements. Well, we leveled off, and each mainline church began to decline numerically just about the time I was ordained. I've always hoped and prayed those two things are not related. We Presbyterians dropped from a national membership of almost 4 million to just under 2 million today, and there's a library of literature analyzing the phenomenon. Here are a few of my light insights for what they're worth. The first is demographic. Churches historically know that they grow when their members more than replace themselves by birth. Well, the birth rate in mainline churches dipped below 2 a few decades ago. Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Episcopalians were simply not having enough babies. Catholics, Mormons, Southern Baptists were and still are, although it is just beginning to happen to the Southern Baptists as well. So maybe you all need to get busy. By the way, Sue and I have done our part. We have 5 children and 13 grandchildren. They're all Presbyterians, so we've made our contribution. The second light observation is about real estate and community change. We have a lot of churches in places where they needed to be 100 years ago, but no longer are, at least in the form that they are there, in urban and rural neighborhoods that have changed dramatically in the past 40 years. In my hometown of Altoona, Pennsylvania, a thriving railroad town of 85,000 in the 1940s and 50s, there were 7 thriving Presbyterian churches. There were enough Presbyterians, there was even a Presbyterian church basketball league. The railroad collapsed, the shops closed, population fell to below 50,000, still falling, and 4 of those 7 Presbyterian churches are closed and 2 are in very difficult straits. The pattern is consistent in every major city. Once thriving churches of 300 to 400 to 500, solid Sunday school programs, regular infant baptisms and weddings saw their neighborhoods change and decline. Today, instead of 400 members, there are 75 members, most of them elderly. The building needs a new furnace, a new roof. There are no children, no baptisms. Now, these are precious communities, but they cannot raise enough money to keep the building in repair and pay the minimum salary, so they barely get by with a supply pastor or no pastor at all. Our very strength exacerbates this problem. We place a strong emphasis on participatory decision-making. We don't like hierarchies with too much authority, so we're not very nimble, to say the least. We can't close or merge these churches, which would save untold dollars and institutional energy, without a process that takes literally years. We cannot start a new church without forming a committee to study the issue, another committee to do a needs analysis, another committee to determine financial viability. Willow Creek, a megachurch in a Chicago suburb, and a good one, can start a church, hire a pastor, rent a hall, and open for business. In the same time it takes the Presbytery of Chicago to organize a nominating committee, to nominate members for the planning committee, to explore possibilities, and do a demographic study. In the meantime, we're caught not only in the sociological and ecclesiastical perfect storm, but in a culture that is undergoing vast transformation. We are, no secret, becoming a secular culture, more secular than at any time in our history. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a new thing. Evidence is all around us. Sunday, the Lord's Day, for instance, used to belong to us, no longer. I worked for 26 years in a church located on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which calls itself a little too proudly the Magnificent Mile. Surrounded on all four sides by high-end hotels, the Four Seasons, Ritz-Carlton, restaurants, shopping malls, Bloomingdale's, Macy's, Tiffany, Victoria's Secret. Sunday is one of the busiest, maybe the busiest day of the week on Michigan Avenue. I found myself at home with an unplanned Sunday off once and decided to ride my bike up the lakefront path. I told this story in the book I wrote about it. It was an important learning experience. The place was crowded with bikers and joggers and walkers. Beaches were packed, softball games, volleyball, soccer leagues in full operation, picnic tables, families, the wonderful aroma of meat on the charcoal grill. I had to remind myself that it's Sunday morning. This used to be our time, about which Wallace Stevens described a holy hush. When I have occasion to talk to new ministers coming to Chicago, I recommend that they do that. Ride a bike or walk on the lakefront on Sunday morning and see where all the people are and what they are doing. Experience how pleasant a Sunday morning is and what we're up against when we open our doors at 11 o'clock, the sacred hour, and simply expect people to come. What happened to Sunday is, of course, just the tip of the iceberg, a symptom of what is happening widely and deeply in North American culture. Douglas John Hall is helpful in describing what has happened to us as disestablishment. Mainline Christianity and Christian churches in North America, Hall maintains, have been supported, propped up, virtually sponsored by custom, convention, and sometimes law, every bit as substantially as the older, actually established churches of Europe. All that is gone now, swept away in the face of the racial and religious diversity of the culture, the new socially and politically viable secularism. For the first time in our history, it's now okay for a Roman Catholic to run for office. It was unthinkable until Kennedy, not so very long ago, or a Jew or a Mormon or a nun, the fastest growing cohort on the religious landscape. Hall, as you probably know, proposes that this is a good and healthy thing. In his very thoughtful book, The End of Christendom and the Future of Christianity, Hall proposes that Christian churches are now free in a new way to be the church authentically, and that people will continue to come to church. The people who continue to come to church will be doing so for the right reasons. Hall thinks denominational religion is already in a lot of trouble. He writes, "It is entirely possible that most of the once powerful ecclesiastical institutions of North America will disappear entirely within the near future." Well, I don't think denominations are going to disappear, but they are already changing. The corporate model, which we Americans adopted with so much enthusiasm, with corporate headquarters, field offices and staff, mission planned and carried out top-down, funded by local churches that send money into the national to do mission on their behalf, that served us well, but it's all over now. It doesn't work. Mission is now local. Congregations want to do mission on their own and are doing it admirably, but money now stays at home. Biblical scholars and historians suggest that the old mainline churches are in a kind of cultural exile, and I find this metaphor helpful. No longer at the center of the action, but at the edge. And they remind us that when Israel was in exile, it wasn't particularly fun, but it was a very creative time. Some of the best and most creative thinking and most sublime literature comes from the time just before and during and immediately after Israel's exile in Babylon. In the big picture, exile is not necessarily a bad place to be. It's a little rough for those of us who are in it at the moment, but it can be a very good time. One of the most refreshing analyses and metaphors comes from sociologist of religion Phyllis Tickle, In her important book, The Great Emergence, you may have read that, she observed that every 500 years or so, the church holds the equivalent of a giant rummage sale. And obsolete, out-of-date, worn-out stuff is sold off to make room for new stuff, better stuff. And Tickle argues that if you think about it, it's happened all the way back to the Exodus, when Moses led Hebrew slaves to freedom. Then the monarchy of King David, building of the Jerusalem temple, then the exile. Big things happen in history in about every 500-year cycles. Jesus in the New Testament, Gregory the Great and the papacy, the split between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, the Protestant Reformation, 500 years later, 500 years ago. Every 500 years, several things seem to happen, she says. There's a split, an offshoot from the mainstream, experienced as a tragedy at the time, maybe even fatal, and a new thing emerges, a new, rigorous, energetic, institutional expression of the original organizing idea. And then the older, established institution renews and re-energizes itself and becomes perhaps a little smaller, but a stronger, better form of the original. The two now move into the future on separate trajectories with more integrity and energy and faithfulness. Roman Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. And it's happening now, even as we sit here thinking about it. Not much in North America, but it's certainly happening in the global South. Do you Canadians watch Downton Abbey? We Americans are crazy about it. With about 10 million other Americans, I found myself hooked last year on Downton Abbey. As that magical, mythical Edwardian era in British history begins to crumble and shake and change. And it occurred to me as I watched that, in a way that mirrors my experience with my church, with the Presbyterian Church. Downton Abbey as a metaphor for mainline Christianity, empire, establishment, privilege, a feudal style of agriculture evolving, women finding their voice, Lord Crawley objecting, pushing back, dragging his feet, just like men I know, just like I have done on occasion. Recently, however, there's an interesting thing beginning to happen, a re-examination and reanalysis of the narrative of decline and despair about mainline Christianity. And it began with the publication of a book by Robert Putnam and David Campbell, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us. Putnam, you may remember, is a Harvard sociologist who caught everybody's attention with a catchy essay, Bowling Alone, an attempt to explain the decline of public community sensibilities and organizations. Putnam discovered that all public organizations were experiencing numerical decline, not just churches, but political parties, neighborhood associations, Rotary, even the venerable PTA. And when he turned to recreation, he discovered a fascinating phenomenon. There were, as he expected, fewer bowling leagues, but the number of individuals who actually went to a bowling alley and bowled a game increased. So he concluded people were bowling alone. American culture was experiencing a loss of public capital. People were staying home, cocooning, watching TV instead of joining neighbors in some common enterprise. Well, Putnam teamed up with a Notre Dame scholar, David Campbell, to do an analysis of what is actually happening to religious institutions based on an exhaustive national poll. And the result is a fascinating and important book. The author began with the 1960s, a major sea change in North American culture that had a huge impact on mainline religion. The sexual revolution, drugs, anti-war movement, student protests, civil rights movement, feminism, bumper stickers that read "Make love, not war," and question authority. It seemed that everything traditional and conventional and safe suddenly came loose. And so Putnam and Campbell say there was a reaction, a counter-movement led by evangelical Christians, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, a full-scale defense, a pushback, a defense of traditional values called family values and beliefs. And the movement took hold immediately. Suddenly, reporters were talking to Falwell and Robertson instead of the Presbyterian stated clerk and the Episcopal presiding bishop. The political right sensed the enormous political potential of this movement and jumped all over it. In fact, co-opted it, and it became the moral majority. An energized political conservatism fueled by traditional Christian language and evangelical Christian leaders. And then some of the rhetoric became strident, harsh, outright mean. Falwell and Roberts declared that national disasters, military threats, even 9/11 were acts of God, punishing America for abortion and gay rights and feminism. The political right was smart enough to want to get away from that, was embarrassed by it and backed away. And so Putnam and Campbell discovered did thousands and thousands of young adults, turned off by narrow moral positions and this obsession with sex, abortion, feminism, homosexuality. Young adults abandoned the churches in droves because of what they were seeing and hearing about religion. And that is where we are today, according to Putnam and Campbell. And I propose that it's not as bad a place as we might imagine for mainline Christians to be. At some point, you have to ask if any of this really matters. Is church all that important? Does Christianity really need the church? Well, the entire history of our faith is the story of God acting in human history and creating a people, a community. Israel's 10 commandments are divided equally between proper relationship with God and proper relationship with the community, with other people. Jesus called individuals to follow him and formed them into a community. He spent a lot of time in the communal structures of his religion, the synagogue, the temple. And the night before he died, he told them that they needed one another, that their unity, their community, their communion would be how the world would know about him. Love one another, he said. And it was just as important as the ancient mandate to love God with heart, soul, and strength and mind. Sometimes people have asked me if Jesus really meant to start an institution. And when my patience with institutional religion grows thin, I ask it too. Did he really mean this? Did he mean the Presbyterian Church, the Vatican, the United Church of Canada, the Pope? Well, the answer is, it seems to me, Jesus clearly intended to leave behind a community of believers, followers, who together would embody the good news of God's love in the world just as he did, and would love one another so conspicuously, would love the world with the same passion he did, so that people would see in them, in their communal life together, something of the truth of God and God's love. I'm hopeful about the future of the church in spite of grim statistics. My hope for the future is that while things might look bad at the moment, and while things may be being chosen for the rummage sale, that we will hold on for dear life to our best and noblest traditions. My hope is that the church, at least our corner of it, will remember and be grateful that liberal Republican democracy shared by both of our nations, so fragile, so important, is based directly on our values, our anthropology, our sense of moral responsibility and accountability. And that incredibly important idea that honest faith always seeks understanding, that truth is in order to goodness, that the pursuit of truth, the free pursuit of truth, is part of what it means to love God with your mind, and that faith never need fear science and rigorous intellectual inquiry. Our culture does need desperately, I believe, the reminder and example of a religion that seeks to be intellectually responsible and is never opposed to or afraid of reason and truth. And the culture needs a religion that remembers and celebrates its long affiliation with art. In fact, it's inspiration of some of the most sublime art the race has ever created, that respects and nurtures the expression of our most precious ideas, not only in words, but also in images and music and dance and poetry and drama. And the culture needs religion that directs human attention away from itself, a public liturgy that leads human consciousness away from narcissism and the radically individualistic market-driven focus on me and my needs and my experience, my feelings, to an awareness of the mysterious, ineffable, holy otherness of God. And the culture needs a religion that takes incarnation seriously, an incarnational church that seeks to love and serve the world unabashedly and unapologetically. A church driven not by growth strategies or fear of the future, but by the example of the one who loved the world so much he died for it. A church like that, I believe, will be interesting, will be compelling in its faithfulness, its integrity, its openness, and its love for the world. It will, I deeply believe, require a renewed emphasis on preaching, an educated, literate ministry, acquainted with the resources of the church's theological history, a deep familiarity with the language and stories of Scripture, and an unwavering commitment to incarnation, the divine encounter with the world God so passionately loves. It must be a worldly ministry, acquainted with the world now, its struggles, its tragedies, its wonderful accomplishments, its awful violence and tragedy. The only preaching that will gain a hearing, and it will, I know, must have street cred. That is, credentials based on experience in the world. No more otherworldly, pious platitudes. No more assumptions that everyone buys what we say because of who we are. No more authoritarianism in religion. It's in the weekly sermon, that unique intersection where Scripture, tradition, the faith and experience of the preacher, the particular life of the particular congregation, all in the context of whatever is happening in the community and nation and world. It's in that 20-minute encounter, in that unique intersection, that good news is proclaimed and will be heard, and healing will happen, and who knows, the dead may be raised. Something is emerging, and no one knows exactly what it will look like. But there is growing consensus and evidence that it will be ecumenical, newly ecumenical, willing to leave the safety of precious tradition, open to truth others have discovered, other Christians, evangelical, liberal, Catholic, Protestant, Pentecostal, and other faith traditions, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu. It will be open-hearted and inclusive, willing to leave behind the safety of old exclusivisms, theological, social, moral. The world is already doing that. Young adults simply don't care about the issues we have been fighting about, issues of who's in and who's out. Even Pope Francis seems to get that. When my children hear me talking about the most recent conflict in my church, about ordaining gay and lesbian Presbyterians or gay marriage, they say, "Dad," and then it's got, that wavery two syllables, "Dad, are you still talking about that? We don't care about that anymore." And it will be missional. It will attempt to be the body of Christ, simply, literally, in the world. Every congregation will begin with not what's our growth plan, what's our institutional survival strategy, but with a simple question: what does God want us to be doing in the world in the name of Jesus Christ? Robert Frost said that he had a lover's quarrel with the world, and anyone who spends any time in the church has a lover's quarrel with it. I do. I'm as impatient as anyone with the church's slowness, its bureaucracy, its disobedience. But I remain high on the church for all the reasons I've been trying to explain, and for another very important thing. I'm high on the church because it is not, in the final analysis, ours at all. It's God's. It's not even our idea. It's God's idea. And God, we have it on the highest authority, is not about to abandon us. So let's stop wringing our hands. Let's stop lamenting our lost grandeur. Let's maybe stop playing the numbers game altogether. After all, who other than Constantine and his followers ever thought it was the church's mission to win, to dominate, to rule? Whoever thought that the way to measure a church's faithfulness and effectiveness, its very validity, was by the numbers? That's a good Western economy game, of course. Biggest means best, right and good. The one with the most toys wins. It's hard, I know, to resist that game. Ministers sometimes play it openly, shamelessly, finding ways to compare membership and budgets and working into congregations into conversations the terrible burdens of managing such a robust, growing church as mine. All my life I've been pulled up short by words the pastor of my family's church said to me in the charge to the pastor in my ordination that night 50 years ago. He said, "John, Jesus does not call you to be successful. Jesus calls you to be faithful." You and I may on occasion think that the measure of our ministry is success, numerical success, financial success. It isn't. It never was. It never will be. We are called to be faithful. I heard delightful Cleo LaRue, the fine homiletics professor from Princeton Seminary, say recently, "Why don't you white mainline Protestants just stop counting? Why don't you remember and celebrate and thank God for all the good things you have done and are doing?" I was a parish pastor for 50 years, and I think I have witnessed the church, being the beloved community, the body of Christ, in so many ways that make me humble and grateful and finally hopeful. I like to remember Glenn Fenema when I begin to wonder about the future of the church. Glenn Fenema had AIDS. He grew up and was a very active member of a church that was vocal about its disapproval of his sexual orientation. He attended there but was increasingly uncomfortable, and he found us through a friend. He started attending and joined the church and literally threw himself into the life of the community, a community that did not and would not reject him for who he was. He volunteered for every mission project. He signed up for a mission trip. He never missed worship on Sunday. His parents, lifelong members of their family church, began to attend with him and eventually became members with him. As his illness advanced, Glenn could not always make it to worship on Sunday morning. So we signed him up for the CD ministry that delivered recorded services to his home. Near the end, he was in a hospice facility, and on my last visit with him, we talked with more depth and honesty than we ever had. We talked about his life, about his faith, what he believed. We talked about his dying. I asked him, "Glenn, what's the hardest part about this?" And he told me the hardest part was at night, trying to fall asleep. He was so very sick, and at night all the activity had ceased in the hospice facility. All the guests had gone home, the lights were turned down, and it was quiet, and he was alone with his pain and illness and with the awareness that he was dying. "That's hard," he said. But then he surprised me by brightening a little. He said, "You know what I do? I turn on my CD player and I put on my headphones and I listen to the Sunday service at church. It settles me down. Sometimes I fall asleep right away during the prelude. Oftentimes I fall asleep during your sermon. I'm not the only one to do that," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "But almost every night," Glenn said, "almost every night I fall asleep like that, here in my bed, but also in my church. And that is why, in spite of everything to the contrary, I remain high on the church, God's church, the church of Jesus Christ. Does Christianity need the church? As a matter of fact, yes. Yes, it does. Thanks be to God for the church. Thanks be to God for the churches that called you to be pastor and preacher. Thanks be to God. Thank you.